So, yeah, so I'm going to try and persuade you that ICOs are not crazy. So we made a hashtag for the event, which is hashtag ICOs are not crazy. So if you want to post anything on that, please go ahead. And if it passes basic local laws about decency and whatever, I'll see it on my phone, and maybe we'll answer a few questions there as well. So I want to do it in a particular way because I want to give you, I hope this isn't too grandiose a framing for it, I want to provide an intellectual superstructure which will explain to you why I think this particular angle is opening up. And I want to show you that it's not just technologists like me that think this, and I want to show you why, in my opinion, this should be a focus of Jersey's attention in the coming months, if not now. So here's the agenda. Should we have a digital currency? How will it work? And I'm going to show you that it's going to be tokens and not Bitcoin. Okay. So I want to start by framing things in terms of digital currencies of one form or another. So I've made my little 5 C's chart here about who might issue digital money in the future. And I've put it in the order of least radical to most radical. So the sort of anchor point is, we could take all of this funny new technology, blockchains and hash tables and digital signatures and all this sort of thing, and we could use it to implement things pretty much the way they are now, which is essentially having commercial banks issue money. So just as a baseline, if you have vague curiosity about how money works at the moment, the money supply in the UK is approximately 3% note, what they call M0, which is notes and coins that are issued by the Bank of England. It's 97% commercial bank credit, which is essentially imaginary. It's a sort of shared illusion that we all, but I mean, it works. I'm not knocking it. So when you go down to the bank to borrow 10 grand to buy a car or something, if in your head you're picturing this sort of Mary Poppins style song and dance going on behind the counter where they're waiting for children to come in and hand over their pennies until they've got 10,000 quid's worth so they can lend it to you, I can assure you that's not what's happening. So when you go down to the bank to borrow 10 grand to buy a car, they just make it up. It's just numbers in a spreadsheet. So they just add 10 grand to your account and off. No, I'm not making this up. This is actually what happens. It's because this is fundamental economics, and it's not as scary as it sounds. So it sounds like the whole economic system is a weird illusion that could go wrong at any time. It really isn't. It's much more sound and stable. I don't know, when you say it like that though. But the point is, most money's imaginary. The public seigniorage on the note and coin issue is actually quite low at the moment because of low interest rates. So when you go to the ATM and take out a £10 note, I'm sure it never occurs to you to wonder where the £10 actually is, since you've got a piece of paper that's worth 0.01 pence. The bank had to buy that from the Bank of England. The Bank of England had to take that money and, because of the vagaries of the Bank Act of 1844, invest it in government bonds, and the interest on those bonds is remitted to the Treasury, less a small amount for the Bank of England's expenses. So it's actually a stealth tax, basically, of about £400 million a year at the moment. But remember, the commercial bank issue of money is 30 times greater. The private seigniorage on the commercial bank issue is colossal. It's about €1,000 per person in Europe. So if you're going to come up with a plan to do something other than that with all of this new technology, you have to take into account there is a colossal barrier to overcome, which is that there are people who make an enormous amount of money out of the way the system works now. So you just need to be realistic about that. So if you say, oh, well, we'll do something different, you've got to have a plan for how you're going to get to there from here. So my first point is there's a baseline, which is commercial banks. Now, one obvious thing to think about if we're looking forward is to, instead of having commercial banks do that, we could have central banks do it. So we have this notion of central bank digital currency. The world's already seen its first central bank digital currency come and go, which was Ecuador. But I noticed yesterday the governor of the Bank of Sweden was saying that if we're going to replace cash with electronic money, which they're close to in Sweden, then we maybe ought to consider money and the payment system as being a public utility, and therefore we ought to have this run by central banks, which has the instantaneous problem of what are you going to do with the commercial banks? Because if you take away money issued from the commercial banks and hand it to the central bank, the commercial banks are going to have to find something else useful to do. It's a bit of a stretch. So it's hard to see how that could happen instantly, but it could happen in a planned way. And the idea of having the central bank issue all of the money a few years ago would have seemed ludicrous. You know, you say the Bank of England and you say, well, why doesn't everybody just have an account at the Bank of England, like a Hotmail address? You know, you just go and get a Bank of England money. And if you want to send money to somebody else, you just send it from one Bank of England account to another Bank of England account, which costs, to all intents and purposes, naught. That would have seemed a little bit far-fetched. But hey, for the Bank of England to do that, that means they'd have to run a system that managed 100 million accounts. I mean, all of the personal accounts plus all of the company accounts. That used to sound like a lot, but Facebook has 2 billion accounts. I mean, the software to run 100 million accounts, you can probably just download for nothing off the internet. It's really not a barrier. The reason why the Bank of England wouldn't want to do that is because they don't want to piss about doing KYC, AML, CTF, PEP, because that's where the real costs are. And you probably read yesterday that the head of Europol is actually a Brit, although I assume not for much longer, a guy called Rob Wainwright. The head of Europol said yesterday, we currently spend $20 billion in Europe on AML, and it's almost all completely wasted. We intercept less than 1% of the flows. So actually there are reasons why it might make sense to have the central bank take this stuff over and just run a system. And then the commercial, this is why, by the way, I forgot the guy's name, but the guy from Deutsche Bank who was in the FT a couple of days ago said there might be no such thing as a bank account in 15 years. This is what he's thinking about. Because if there was a central bank system like M-Pesa but run by the Bank of England, then commercial bank accounts would just be skins on top of that. So your Lloyd's account is actually just a Bank of England account with a different logo on the front, because the money transfers would be instant and free. This is not a crazy idea. There's a big plus reason for doing it, which, I mean, some people might feel a little uncomfortable about the Bank of England and central government observing every single transaction. And they bitch and moan about privacy, but they all sign up for Facebook, so I don't take them seriously about any of this sort of stuff. But it is sort of interesting that the finance minister could get up in the morning and look at a dashboard on his laptop which would tell him exactly what economic activity there'd been in the country yesterday, which at the moment he can't. So at the moment you have this weird situation where decisions about fiscal and monetary policy are made on the basis of an incomplete information lag. The most famous example of this, of course, being Dennis Healey going cap in hand for the IMF because he thought we were going to go bankrupt, and it turns out we weren't. Somebody just added the numbers up wrong. You know, the idea that you could get up in the morning and actually see what had been going on in the country. I mean, who'd spent how much money on what? I mean, that's quite an interesting way forward. Art thought of it first, of course. There's an old Robert Heinlein book called Beyond the Horizon, which has this as a central conceit. Now, so the third possibility is, what if we take all of the new technology and just leave it to its own devices? So what if instead of having banks in charge of this thing, or central banks in charge of it, why don't we just get out of the way? Just let cryptography take over. So let the fantasies of the Bitcoin lunatics, you know, evolve and develop and go in different directions. People will come up with new and better ways of doing these things. So why not just leave them to do it? And there is an interesting historical precedent for this, because in the 19th century, when there was a problem with the circulating medium of exchange in the UK, because of the industrialised economy and the need of factories to have money wages and so on, and there wasn't enough money in circulation. So you had private companies step in to make token monies, the Birmingham button makers, which is very good for Wales actually, because all the copper came from Welsh mines. And what happened was companies would just make their own money, but then they had the inevitable economic catastrophe, which is called the big problem of small change, which is if you compete to provide the circulating medium of exchange, you can't make a profit out of it because it's driven down to, the margins are driven down to zero. So eventually the government has to step in and take it over. But actually that's not a bad idea, because at that point you've had 30 or 40 years of experiment and you know which tokens work and who makes the best tokens and so on, so the government can just step in and take over the production of the copper token money itself. So you could see an analogy here, which is to say, well, actually, why don't we just get out of the way, let these people get on with it, and in a few years' time, when one of them's figured out a son of Bitcoin that actually makes any sense, then we'll just step in and nationalize it, and that will provide the, the Swedish model. So, we could just leave cryptography alone and just let it evolve and develop, and then at the appropriate time, step back in, but not through commercial banks or central banks. Just turn it into a utility like the electric company. Now, of course, there are some reasons for not doing that as well, of course, which is that certainly the way it works at the moment, given that I read today that Bitcoin is now using more energy than the whole of Ireland, despite the transactions being at a 3-year low. And of course, it will remain theoretically vulnerable to a 51% attack unless it's using half of all the energy in the entire known universe, which in my opinion is the best explanation for dark matter, which is clearly Bitcoin mining that's been discovered by some ancient alien civilization. They're sucking up all of the energy in the universe. We have to come up with a better idea, and so far nobody has. So the next possibility is to say, well, why don't we change, instead of making the exorbitant privilege of money creation the special construct of banks, why don't you just let any company do that? Why don't you just let anybody who follows the rules, just let them make the money? Okay, so instead of having Bank of England money, or going back to what we had before 1844, which is where you had the different banks had their own money, why don't you just let anybody make money, right? We live in a world of laser beams and transistors and things like that. There's no particular reason why we should restrict the creation of money to 10 companies or 20. Just let any company that follows the rule. I mean, any company that follows the rules can issue its own stock. Any company that follows the rules can issue its own debt, so why not just let any company that follows the rules issue its own money? Put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that a bit later on. That sounds radical. It's not as radical as it sounds. And then the fifth possibility is to say, well, wait a second, the fundamental characteristic of the technology is that it's decentralizing in nature, and maybe that's the thing that we should look at. So if we let the technology decentralize, right, because there are some of us who clearly think that the Napoleonic structure of the nation state is no longer the best basis for creating money and creating transaction zones, what level does it devolve down to? Does it devolve down to Dave? Dave has his own money, right? Or does it devolve down to the level of Jersey having its own? I mean, what level does it devolve down to? And I'll make a couple of suggestions to where I think that might go as well. So those are the kind of 5, you'll see why I need you to go through this, because otherwise the token thing won't fit into something. I want to show you it fits in. So these are the 5 ways we can produce the money. So what do we think about all of these? Do we let commercial banks do it? Actually, you're all too young to remember this, but we actually tried this once before in the 1990s. That's me at the launch of Mondex in Swindon. And I won't give away Tony's age by revealing his role in this whole sorry tale, but we did try before to have money that was under the control of the central banks, but issued in digital form by the commercial banks. It didn't work for a variety of reasons, but the lessons have been learned, as they say. If you were going to do that now, you wouldn't do it with cards, you'd do it with mobile phones, obviously. This is, in essence, the Chinese approach. So when the governor of the People's Bank of China said a couple of weeks ago, he said, I can't remember, he said something like, we're going to get rid of money in 10 years. The 1,000-year Chinese experiment with paper. I mean, they were the first people to have paper money. They're going to be the first people to get rid of it. He said, we're going to go for a 2-tier approach, double-tier approach. And this is what he means. He means like we tried before with cards, it didn't work, but they're going to do it with phones. And I wouldn't bet against them on this. So you have the central bank in control of the parameters, but the commercial banks actually use the technology to issue the money. Now, in this sort of situation, you could easily see some form of permission ledger that was operated by the banks and other regulated institutions. So therefore, you wouldn't need all the proof of work nonsense and use up all the electricity in Ireland, right? Actually, I did have they said no to my idea about this, but I was thinking, as a way of trying this out, if you go to the ATM, right, like most of the time the ATM is not doing anything. So what you could do is you could make ATMs the nodes for mining these transactions, right? They're not doing anything. And then, because every ATM would have a complete copy of the ledger, when the Birch at RBS accidentally pull out the plug to do the vacuuming, instead of nobody being able to use the ATM or their debit, you'd still be able to use the ATM because every ATM would have a complete copy of the ledger. So there's an obvious way to try this idea out, without being too disruptive. So I even know where to start on this one. Quite feasible. Why would we go for the central bank option? The Bank of England working paper on central bank digital currency said that the potential economic boost that will come from shifting to digital currency will be in the region of 3 to 4%, i.e. non-trivial. And there are, broadly speaking, two reasons as to why that would be so great. One is that it reduces friction in the economy by not messing around with cash. And remember, the costs of cash are quite high. You don't see them because they're diffuse. But when somebody is paying for these trucks to drive around and fill up ATMs and go and collect the money from shops and all this, you don't see it because it's diffuse, but it's a significant cost. So you get rid of all of that. But they don't say it like this, but I've rephrased it like this. Cash doesn't have an API. Whereas if there was a digital currency that was implemented on a sort of national basis with a standard published API, all sorts of clever people, I'm too old to think of what you would do with this sort of thing, but I'm sure young people will come up with some fantastic ideas of what you could build on top of it. And so the Bank of England, I think, correctly concluded that this would lead to more innovation. So actually, that's not a bad idea either. The third possibility is cryptography. I'm a bit skeptical about this because a lot of the sort of claimed benefits for the cryptographic approach, I think, are largely imaginary. I don't want to rehearse all of them, but when you go to one of these Bitcoin events, I mean, I went to the Bitcoin thing in Moorgate a couple of weeks ago, which was like it was like going to the moonies. I'm not even joking. I mean, there's like people, zombie-like trances, and they're cheering, and there's a guy on stage who's saying meaningless mumbo jumbo, and everybody's like, yeah, whatever. So all of the, so for example, they come, wow, for example, with Bitcoin, of course, you've got anonymity. It's not true, by the way. It's not anonymous, but don't break it to them. You've got anonymity. Well, who wants that? I don't understand what the demand for that is. I don't want that. That sounds good if you're 19 years old and an MIT computer science undergraduate, self-sovereign man. We don't want the government interfering with all. That sounds great until your grandma presses the wrong button in an email and her life savings go to Vladivostok and there's no way of getting them back, right? So these things don't make any sense. But the key reason for not doing it, this idea of, we'll all be responsible for our own money and so on, will never. Okay, really? Do you really want that? Do you want that? I don't. I'm far too irresponsible to be in charge of all of that stuff. I want that stuff in the hands of a regulated financial institution I can sue if it goes wrong. If I drop my USB stick and the dog eats it, I'm buggered. I don't want that, right? This idea, we're all going to look after our own keys is hilarious. So actually, I don't take this particularly seriously. So the picture, so I did come up with one sort of, you can print out these private keys as a QR code if you want to. But people they call them cold wallets. So they print them out on pieces of paper and bury them in the garden and stuff like this. So I printed mine out, but I had it tattooed onto my scrotum. I'm just saying it works for me. I'm not saying that would work for everybody, but my warm wallet solution, I think, is not too bad. The fourth one is companies. Now this is starting to sound a little bit crazier, but bear with me on this one for a moment. So these three pictures left to right, that's M-Pesa, which is in use in Kenya, where basically the entire adult population uses electronic money, which is held in a one-to-one reserve in a bank with a national currency. So the idea that you could have a company issuing money which would be used at population scale, we know that to be true because we've got a practical example of it right there. But actually, when M-Pesa was created, it was quite hard to make that kind of money because you had to have SIM cards and cryptography and big mainframes. Also, now you don't. That's a guy. That's a T. I'll show you the picture of the guy wearing this if I can find it on my laptop. I'll just say, when I was his age, I had a Motorhead T-shirt. This is how times have changed. He's got a make your own currency T-shirt with no future for people like me. That's a smart contract in Ethereum for making your own. So this is where the tokens are coming from, right? Anybody that wants to make their own money can, okay? And here's an example of some people that were making their own money. So this is Tezos, which is one of the most famous of the ICO examples. So the Tezos guys decided, actually this Ethereum thing's really good, but you need something that's a bit better than Ethereum, because one of the problems with Ethereum is it was never designed for this sort of thing. I mean, people have started using it for it, but that's not what it was designed for. And it has issues, right? So you can imagine we tokenize stuff and we put it all on the ledger, and then CryptoKitties 2 comes out, and you're trying to do your house purchase and nothing happens because the entire ledger is ground to a halt. Have you played CryptoKitties? You should. CryptoKitties is awesome. I mean, you should look at the code. I mean, as a demonstration of what can be done in that new world, it is astounding. So the way CryptoKitties, you've never played with crypto, you're an uncurious lot, you've never played with CryptoKitties. CryptoKitties are exactly what they sound like. It's little cats that live on the blockchain. But the little cats have DNA. They have 1,024 bits of DNA. And you can crossbreed them. And when you crossbreed them, they mutate and you get new versions and stuff like that. And if you crossbreed them, occasionally you'll get very rare breeds, just like you do with dogs and cats and things like that. So with the CryptoKitties, you know, your kitty and my kitty might, you know, if they love each other very much. And one of the offspring could be one of the most amazing kitties ever. People pay astonishing amounts of money to have them. They're on the blockchain. You can't copy them or fake them, right? So if you've got this amazing kitty that has funny shaped ears or whatever else it is that people are paying for, that's real money. There was so much CryptoKitty trading going on, the Ethereum blockchain ground to a halt because of this. But it's a very interesting example of what you can do in that world. People should pay more attention to these kind of things. Anyway, so the people at Tezos decided, what if there was something like Ethereum, but it was more suited to these smart contracts and so on? Right, we'll raise some money. And they set out to raise $20 million. And they did it by running a smart contract on top of Ethereum. They're creating an ICO, an initial coin offering, which is a particular kind of token, running on the net. They wanted $20 million. They raised $250 million. And actually, by the time, this is going to sound worse than I mean it to, by the time it got out of court, they had $400 million because the value of all the cryptocurrencies had gone up. $400 million. Now, that's at the sane end of the spectrum. I mean, there are ICOs out there which make absolutely no sense, and people still invest in them, right? But I mean, then people go down to William Hills and stuff, don't they? So you can't read anything into that. Anyway, but you see what I'm saying here? Like, we already know people will accept private money at population scale. Private money is now easy to make, and we have the existence proof that if you construct decent ICOs, people will buy into them on a large scale. So actually, what if the money of the future isn't the bitcoins and ether and all this sort of stuff that's underneath the ledger? What if the money of the future is actually these tokens? Let's just plant that thought with you. So let's spend a couple of minutes looking at what tokens are. So this is my super quick model of what on earth is going on the ledger and so on. So here's one example, which is Ethereum. So ignore the stuff in the middle. But basically at the top, what you can see is the ICOs and tokens are essentially values exchanged between smart contracts. We don't want to get into that because we all know they're not smart and they're not contracts, but that's what everybody else calls them, so I have to call them that. Actually, they're just apps. They're a special kind of app that runs on the shared ledger. So think about tokens as values that are exchanged between these apps that live on top of the shared ledger. Just think of it in that way, and that will see you through. So here's one example, which is Ethereum, but you know, there's other ways you could do it in different cases. I mean, the reason why people do it in Ethereum is because the Ethereum programming language, which is Solidity, is more well developed for writing these kind of not smart contracts, but actually apps. Okay, so that's Kathleen and Arthur Brightman who launched Tezos, and with some parasitic hanger-on who's trying to get some of the $400 million. Now when they raised it through what's known as the Zook effect. So there's a place in Switzerland called Zook, and Zook set out to be the crypto epicenter of the world. And they created a regulatory structure which these people were able to take advantage of. And the regulatory structure, by the way, I'm not suggesting Jersey adopt this, I'm saying Jersey learn from it. The regulatory structure they adopted was a farcical thing to do. I'm sure it was KPMG or someone put them up to it. It's like farcical thing to do with, well, because they're all in Switzerland, aren't they? Whenever you get an email from KPMG or PwC, there's always this funny thing at the bottom, but this isn't really a company. It's some weird thing in Switzerland that you don't actually understand. So it's that sort of thing. So basically, when you bought one of these tokens, you weren't really buying a share in the company. If you read page 200 of the small print, you discovered you were actually making a charitable donation to a Swiss foundation, which promised to have the best interests of this at heart. And what a surprise, it's all ended up in court. So it's taken a while for it to trickle through. But it shows the demand, right? And this is why there is a serious jurisdictional competition underway to try to construct the right regulatory framework for these tokens to take place in. And if you look at the Swiss, well, I'll go to the Swiss example in a second. And more to the point, there's $9 billion gone into this stuff already, nearly $10 billion now, I should imagine. It's serious money. Okay, so what would have to happen for tokens to become regulated properly so they would become an investable asset class? Well, actually not much, right? If one regulator somewhere constructs an appropriate regulatory structure that everybody else can learn from, then the problem is well on the way to being solved. And this is exactly what the Swiss have done. So a couple of weeks ago, FINMA, which was the Swiss regulator, came up with this proposed regulatory strategy, and they said, well, if we take the smart contracts, the apps, and we use them to implement, broadly speaking, 3 different kinds of tokens. So security tokens, which give you some claim over some sort of asset, utility tokens, which give you access to something, and what they call money tokens, which is what I would call digital currencies. I mean, they're envisaging that real tokens will actually be some combination of these things. But actually, if we regulate on principle on that basis, we have a viable regulatory strategy, and I agree with them. I think they do. The jurisdictional competition around this is going to be very high, because that 9 billion, I'm telling you, is just a drop in the ocean. When this becomes a regulated market, it's going to be vast. Now, why am I going on about companies as the issuers of these things rather than banks or special purpose instruments? Well, there's a chap called Edward de Bono. I'm not sure if any of you are old enough to remember this, but when I was your age, we used to get sent on management training courses where they would make you sit around with different colour hats. Did you ever have to do this? Anybody here? You remember? This really happened, didn't it? Yeah. So you had to have different coloured hats, and the green hat meant you were creative. From the finance department. Oh no, creative. That's right. And the black hat meant
critical thinker.
Oh yeah, black was critical thinker. That's right. So anyway, that was him. That was Edward de Bono. He was the guy that thought up that thing about the hats, and he wrote this book about lateral thinking. It's all a long time ago. But in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, he wrote a thing called the IBM dollar. And remember, this is long before the internet and Mondex and digital money and all this sort of thing. And de Bono said, hold on a second, if everything gets wired up in some sort of global instantaneous network, why would we use the same assets to trade across that network as we do now? Surely it would change. And he said, well, wait a second, what if every company, instead of issuing traditional equity and debt, because he could see that if you could issue bearer instruments into a liquid market, that would be a much less expensive market to operate because there'd be no clearing and settlement. So when I send you the asset, you've got the asset, that's end of, right? I mean, this is in the 1990s he was thinking about this stuff. And so he said companies wouldn't have bank accounts. They would hold these baskets of essential assets, the baskets of what we would now call tokens. And when it came to dealing with somebody else, you would exchange, according to what he calls pre-agreed algorithms, these baskets of tokens. Now that sounds complicated if you're a person, but it's not complicated if you're a computer, right? So in the future, like if I wanted to buy something from you, right, if we had to dick about with my 1,000 different tokens trying to work out which ones you wanted, it would never happen. But that's a nanosecond for my AI to talk to his AI and sort that out. What's your portfolio? What are you trying to, de Bono was so ahead of his time in all this sort of thing. So what he was talking about as this company money, I think provides an intellectual structure for thinking about tokens. Don't think about tokens as something that belong to banks or financial. Think about them as something that any company could issue. Now, By the way, I should just say, when I was in Singapore a couple of weeks ago for Money 2020 Asia, which has nothing to do with the presentation, it's my jet set lifestyle. I just wanted to, yeah. So, but there's nice pubs around here as well, aren't there? So yeah. I had the opportunity to interview a guy called Jonathan Larson on stage. Jonathan Larson is head of corporate venture capital for Ping An. Ping An, makes RBS look like the corner shop, basically. I mean, Ping An has got countless trillions under management. And the corporate venture capital is a 1 billion global fund at the moment. They're investing in different things. And he said, when the market is regulated, they're going to tokenize everything. I mean, and he meant everything. Because bearer markets that operate without clearing and settlement are more efficient markets. You can trade more frequently, you can trade at lower overhead. And because you can tokenize assets that are currently instrumentless, and the example he gave was mortgage fractions, you can't trade part of your house, whereas of course you can tokenize it very effectively. He was very clear, and he's not a technologist, he's not some techno-utopian deterministic nutcase like me. He's a guy that runs a huge fund in China. And he was very clear, token markets are more efficient markets. When they're regulated, he's going to tokenize everything. And then we go on to the final possibility, which is the sort of the community stuff. Now, what if, in addition to companies, so let's imagine this rich token infrastructure of the future, right? So we've got banks issuing tokens, right? We've got companies issuing tokens, but because of the decentralizing nature of the technology that I spoke at the beginning, you could have other levels of token issuing. And one that I'm very curious about is the community level. And this goes to the point about money being smart. You see, because when I give you a £5 note, the £5 note doesn't know where it's been or what it's doing, okay? But when we exchange tokens through smart contracts, they do. And they can enforce rules and community norms. It's smart money. So there could be different kinds of communities that issue their own tokens. And one that I'm particularly interested in is cities. This is the World Economic Forum, not me. I mean, I agree with this, but the World Economic Forum view, which is that cities are the unit of economic advancement and innovation, is basically correct. This is the old Jane Jacobs thing about cities and the wealth of nations. So the idea that one particular kind of community that could issue its own money is the city, I think people don't take seriously enough. I mean, it sounds mad, but actually, why wouldn't London have its own money? Why wouldn't Jersey have its own money? You know, at the moment, we assume that the nation state should have its own money, but others should. So like we'll all sit around and say, oh, well, the euro's never going to work because Germany and Greece don't have the same economy. That's true. But nor does Jersey and Middlesbrough. So why they're using the same money, I haven't the slightest idea. How can you have an interest rate policy that makes sense for both of those? And at the moment, we have a very inefficient system of government transfer payments to make it up. So we take money from London and we give it to Middlesbrough, but we spend it on things the government decides, right? Whereas if Middlesbrough money and London money were different, Middlesbrough money would just slide against London money. And it would make sense for people living in London to then create businesses in Middlesbrough because it's cheaper for them to do it. You wouldn't need the government's not very invisible hand to do this. Now, it's a very sad thing I read in the Telegraph a few days ago. There's a chap called Sir Richard Boddy, who used to be the MP for part of Lincolnshire, died a few days ago. And 20 years ago, I was at an event with him. He was very militantly anti the EU. And one of the things he was also militantly against was government transfer payments. And he was very much in favour of having regional currencies. And I remember talking with him at an event, and he was saying about this, and somebody in the audience said, well, it'd be crazy, how could London have its own money? And he goes, well, Iceland's got its own money, it's only got 250,000 people. That's the same size as Bristol. You know, like you're thinking about this all wrong. So the idea of cities having their own money and being one of the token issuers, I think should be taken more seriously. And actually, when I was preparing these slides, I noticed that yesterday, the Mayor of Seoul announced that he intends to do precisely this. and use cryptocurrency technology to create soul money. And I also noticed that the city of Birch, I mean, I used to live in San Francisco, so I can tell you, you don't necessarily have to take what's happening in Berkeley as being kind of any kind of weather vane for the real world. But nevertheless, Berkeley intends to be the first city to do an initial community offering. They're going to issue their own tokens, which they're going to use instead of municipal bonds. So when I was preparing these slides, I was thinking, you know, I'm going to work, because I really want you guys, it sounds like a crazy idea, but I want you guys to take it seriously. And this is what, meanwhile, in the real world, nothing I can imagine hasn't already happened. That's how limited my imagination is. So, so here's my diagram. Here's my model. These are the two things I want to leave you with. So here's my sort of model of how this all fits. You don't have to pay attention if you don't want to. I just wanted to show you that in my crackpot plan, things do sort of hang together. So down here we've got shared ledgers, cryptocurrencies, but those are just numbers. They don't mean anything. And remember, the Bitcoin price is just a price. It's just a number. It doesn't mean anything, okay? And for some people, that's okay. Some people are perfectly happy to trade those units that don't mean anything, and that's absolutely fine. But actually most people aren't. Most people will want those values to be linked to some kind of asset. So we need institutions that link tokens, create tokens, which link assets to those numbers in the ledgers. Because we want to trade on the ledger with no clearing and settlement, but we want somebody to link those numbers to things in the real world. So this is where the tokens sort of fit in. And then on the far side, and I personally, I think that's the vast majority of trading. The vast majority of trading is that. Almost all trades you take part in, like when you walk into the shop to buy a chocolate bar, who you are is really irrelevant to the transaction, okay? So just exchanging tokens works. But for some transactions, you do need to know who you are. So at some point, you've got to link the tokens to people, and that's where, you know, KYC and all that sort of stuff comes in. And I think that sort of hangs together, and I think it gives us these three layers to work with, which in terms of constructing a regulatory framework, I think give us some pegs to hang things on, at least. And there's the thing about Jonathan Larson. I don't need to repeat that. So here's my last. So to summarise, then, why do I think tokens are the smart money? Well, because the money we have now is just a value. Money as a distributed application can do so much more. And remember what I said about putting the API on top and all that sort of thing. I shouldn't say APU, let's say money with an API. I don't know what an APU is. Money that substitutes for memory. I mean, it's a very famous statement, Koshilakota. Money is a primitive form of memory. But of course, now we have money that has a memory. We used to run this, well, we still do, we used to run this art competition about the future of money. And a few years ago, one of the students submitted this idea. And he said, what if banknotes, because he was playing around with these LED displays, these LED paper displays, you know, that they only use power when you're changing them. Once they've changed, they stay the same. And he was trying to think of what to do with them. He said, well, what if you had banknotes where somebody gave you a £10 note, you could look on the back and you could see the Facebook profiles of all the people that had it before, right? It'd be sort of cool, like to know that you had money that had once belonged to David Beckham or something, right? That would be kind of a fun thing. And everybody derided this as a completely implausible. That's exactly what Bitcoin is. That's exactly what it is. You can see every single thing that a coin has ever done on the register. It has a memory. Money you can make, now you have money that makes decisions about you. If you're talking about programmable smart money sitting in these applications, you could easily have the situation where I go into a shop to buy a packet of fags and it won't work because you can't use Islamic e-dinars to buy fags. You've got to think of something else with it, right? Why not have smart money? Money that doesn't let you do things. The community, like if you're part of a community, you buy into those community values. That's why you're using the money. So if the money doesn't let you do things which are outside the community's values, good. That's great. Money that's a more dynamic property. Remember, communities means lots of different things. It doesn't just mean geographic. I mean, I'm talking about cities because I'm particularly interested in that. But communities are we all belong to lots of different communities. And those communities would all have their own money, which privilege low transaction costs within the community at the expense of slightly higher transaction costs, which are linked to credit and all this sort of thing, between communities. So I think not only do tokens have an intellectual underpinning, which make them make sense, and not only does the technology that we have already and the technologies we're building give us the ability to implement the vision of people like De Bono from all those years ago, but actually the economic advantage that comes from moving to these lower cost, better regulated financial markets will be of enormous value, which is why that 9 billion is just absolutely a drop in the ocean. So yes, a lot of it's crazy. Lots of people are getting arrested. I see some more people arrested today for their ICO with Floyd Mayweather, the boxing guy. I hope they don't put him in the same cell as him, because I'm sure he's pretty pissed off about it. So yes, people are being arrested every jail. Yes, lots of people are going to go to jail. But when this market is regulated, it's going to be huge. And Jersey needs to drive a stake in the ground for that now. Thanks for listening.